Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
But from me, Richard Straker, on behalf of all of my colleagues here on BBC One, it is time to wish you a peaceful good night, and we wish that you'll join us again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.
The Closedown feels like something from the good old days of television. Here in the UK, we haven't experienced a classic Closedown since before the turn of the millennium, and we certainly had our own distinct style. A look ahead to the following day's programmes, a look at the weather forecast, perhaps even a short public information film or two, all rounded off by a look at the channel's clock, a final word from the announcer, before God Save the Queen would blast through your eardrums. Quite the way to help you get ready for bed, right? But what about in other countries? Everywhere must have had their own style for a TV Closedown. On this expedition, we'll be trekking all the way across the world to the lovely little nation known as New Zealand, and how for almost 20 years, the Closedown on a specific channel would work its way into the very fabric of pop culture for the country, all thanks to a friendly Kiwi and their cat. You could argue that New Zealand was one of the late adopters of television as a medium, not launching a service until 1960, nearly a quarter of a century after the BBC first set up shop back in Britain. It had been announced the year prior, in 1959, by then Prime Minister Walter Nash, that New Zealand would have television within the year, and sure enough, his predictions came to pass, with the first broadcast occurring on the 1st of June 1960. This had been a long time coming, as various delays and concerns regarding the introduction of television had permeated throughout the country since the end of the Second World War. There was also the challenge relating to the country's geography, as New Zealand has a sparsely spread population, with some areas having very few people, and transmitters would need to be set up in very tricky terrain. However, one of the biggest reasons for why the government decided to implement television in a hurry was from the rise of private enterprise. In Auckland, the Bell Radio Television Company had set up its own transmitters to broadcast entertainment via the telly, which at the time would have been deemed illegal. But with its popularity growing, the government, under Walter Nash, essentially had its hand forced. Thus, in 1960, Auckland's channel, AKTV2, would be the first official television channel to go on the air that June. Over the next few years, more key areas such as Christchurch and Wellington would receive their own local stations, all of which would broadcast the same programmes. Television was run by the state, before the establishment of the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation, or the NZBC. This new body had the government keeping an eye on it, and was heavily based on the BBC model that had been used in the UK. Viewers would pay a licence fee to legally consume their telly, and though things got off to a slow start, by the mid-60s more than 300,000 television licences had been sold, roughly an eighth of the population at that time. The vast majority of programming in the early days was imported, from either Britain or America, giving locals the chance to experience popular programming from the other side of the world. As the 60s went on and developed into the 70s, more and more local programming was being created, to a great response from audiences. Despite the initial fears or concerns any may have had, television had arrived in New Zealand, and was here to stay. The next major innovation came in October of 1973, when colour television was launched in New Zealand. Many attribute its arrival to mark the fact that just a few months later, the country would play host to a major sporting event, the Christchurch Games. Seeing sport in colour was immensely popular for audiences across the world, so it's no surprise that New Zealanders met this transition with an eager response. A little while later, it was finally announced that a second television channel would broadcast on the airwaves from 1975, something many had lobbied for since television had first arrived in New Zealand 15 years earlier. The NZBC, still able to maintain its monopoly, would be reorganised into 3 companies, one for radio and 2 for the now 2 television channels, marking the start of a brand new era for TV in New Zealand. So with all that, this is where the Kiwi comes in, making its first appearance alongside their cat in 1975 on what was then TV2. This channel was brand new, launching on the 30th of June the same year. And when it comes to kiwis, I'm not referring to the tasty fruit, for a kiwi also refers to a species of flightless birds that are native to, you guessed it, New Zealand. The bird has become quite a unique focal point for New Zealand, its people, and its culture, so it only makes sense that the bird be chosen as the animal to lead a television closedown. Rather than a continuity announcer shutting things down before a play of the national anthem, instead we are treated to a charming animated sequence featuring the kiwi and their cat closing up shop, before bidding the viewers goodnight. Supposedly, inspiration was taken from nearby Australia, who around the same time used an animated kangaroo to mark the close down of their television service. If they could use one of their native species for the occasion, then why shouldn't New Zealand use one of theirs? Let's look at the first iteration of these iconic New Zealand characters. Despite not being from New Zealand, I can instantly see how these characters, and this style of close down, proved to be so popular. Without trading a word of dialogue, the short story told between the Kiwi and the cat is charming, simple, and really wholesome, giving across that cosy feeling that you'd precisely want at the end of the night. The animation's fantastic too, and was realised by Sam Harvey, a former Disney animator who does a great job at keeping things looking fluid without overcomplicating matters throughout the sequence. The song you hear is quite fittingly a lullaby, known as Hine I Hine. This arrangement was done by Bernie Allen and fits the mood beautifully. Combined with the visuals, it's a match made in heaven. Although the Kiwi doesn't need to grasp the poor cat by the neck now, does he? Oh, the 70s. What a time. Strangely, after just a year, the Goodnight Kiwi sequence, as it came to be known, would be revamped for 1976. At the same time, TV2 was itself undergoing a complete rebrand, now going by the moniker of South Pacific Television. Let's see the second version of the close down, see what's changed, what's remained the same, and most importantly, if it keeps up that same cosy feeling as the original.
Well, it's 27 minutes to midnight, and this is South Pacific Television. Television 2, a service of the Broadcasting Corporation of New Zealand. On behalf of all the staff, this is Ross Goodwin wishing you a very good night.
Very different from the original, but let's get the obvious out of the way. Where's the Kiwi's cat? You could argue the Kiwi himself is the main star, but I don't know, not having the cat alongside him causing mischief takes away from the whole thing. That's not to say this revamp is bad, far from it. The animation is still as gorgeous as ever, and I quite like this new scenario we have as well. Jumping down from the helm of a camera, we see the Kiwi give everything a dust-off before climbing into said camera, the viewer of which is realised as his bedroom. It's a fun little concept, and as we see the Kiwi himself get ready for bed, he closes the shutters of the camera before a goodnight message from the channel itself is played. The ending here I'm a bit mixed on. The sharp cutaway from the animation to the caption card does feel a bit abrupt. A cleaner cut or even just a fade would have worked out better in my view. Secondly, whilst I'm all for a goodnight caption card, it does kind of feel like this red eye is staring right at you through the screen. Had it been spinning like we saw at the beginning, I think it would have made this a little less eerie. Ultimately, I think I still prefer the original version from 1975, but this variant still has a lot to like. At its core, it remains the same cute, wholesome little close down sequence with mood-appropriate music and visuals to boot. This clip would remain in service until around 1980, when when South Pacific Television would bid viewers adieu, being rebranded to Television 2. Goodnight Kiwi would once again receive a fresh new version to air on both TV2 and also the flagship channel, TV1. For the entire 1980s, the third version of Goodnight Kiwi would end up with a closing caption displayed over the animation, and, for the first few years of the 90s, this was swapped out for a voiceover bidding viewers goodnight, the clip now exclusively airing on Channel 2.
Goodnight from Channel 2.
But the example of this variant I wanted to show you comes from the 19th of October 1994 specifically, as it's the final time that Goodnight Kiwi would be seen by New Zealanders, as Channel 2 came to a close. We'll explain the reasons in just a moment, but for now, here is the final time the Kiwi and his cat bid viewers a peaceful goodnight.
It's Goodnight from Channel 2.
That had a strangely somber feeling to it, don't you think? You can tell this third and final version had been designed with the 1980s in mind. Everything feels that bit more technological and sophisticated, even though the animation style has largely remained the same. One of the big differences from the previous two has absolutely got to be the colour palette. This version showcases darker tones, the night sky being beautifully drawn and showcased as the Kiwi exits the control room and heads up the transmitter to bed. These night sky vibes just help enhance the atmosphere, and the feeling that we, alongside the Kiwi and his cat, are settling down to bed. And yes, the cat has thankfully returned, remaining just as silly and playful as he was back in 1975. I also like the little touches dotted throughout, like the fact that the Kiwi's bed this time around is a satellite dish, a very prominent piece of tech throughout the 80s and 90s. The final airing of the Closedown was marked with a special caption card at the end, which reads, "Good night, Kiwi and cat. We're going to miss you. Boo-hoo. Sleep well. From all of us here at TVNZ." A very understated but sweet tribute to two characters who had come to be instantly recognisable to millions of New Zealanders, and who had marked the closing down of operations across TVNZ for the past 20 years. So, why were they not coming back? Well, starting from October the 20th, 1994, Channel 2 would be offering a 24-hour broadcast service, a feature which was becoming increasingly common for TV channels all across the world. So, if the station was operating 24/7, the need for a close down was no longer necessary. Many have since mourned the loss of a traditional television close down, as most channels these days operate a 24-hour service. Even those that stop airing normal programming don't close down in the same way that they used to, either just displaying caption cards, teleshopping, a promotional reel, or a complete mix. For New Zealanders, it may have seemed like they would never see the Kiwi and cat grace their screens again. Thankfully, they would make a grand return. 13 years after bidding viewers their final goodnight, the Kiwi and cat would make a comeback on the then recently launched TVNZ6, a channel which didn't operate a 24-hour schedule. It was a welcome return for one of New Zealand's cultural icons, now front and centre for newer generations too, presented in 16:9 no less, though I think I'll always prefer the 4:3 original. Goodnight Kiwi would also start airing on another new channel, TVNZ7, which began broadcasting in 2008. Together with his cat, both characters would bid viewers goodnight until both channels were wound down completely in 2011 and 2012 respectively. Ever since its noughties revival, the Kiwi and cat have appeared in specially commissioned idents, as well as retrospectives and, of course, parodies. But the essence of the original is still very much treasured and beloved by the New Zealanders who grew up with it. Whether you remember them from back in the day, or saw them during their revival, or are learning about them for the very first time, I think we can all agree that Goodnight Kiwi encapsulates that unique feeling that television could have back in the analogue days. when fun little oddities such as this would crop up, seemingly drastically simple in their execution, but leaving a huge impact on the viewers at home, as well as popular culture. It's whimsical, it's wholesome, it's quite wondrous, and really hits that cosy nighttime spot. The perfect close-down sequence to mark the end of an evening's broadcast, and wishing all watching a peaceful good night.
First of all, it's nighttime when he goes to bed, right? But Kiwis are nocturnal. He should be getting up. Secondly, where does he go to sleep? Up, way up high, in a satellite dish. He's a flightless bird. He's supposed to be on the forest floor. He must have been scared out of his wits up there. Thirdly, what goes to bed with him? A cat. A cat. One of the greatest predators of the Kiwi. Its only natural enemy. He tried to shut it in the lift, but still, when he got under his duvet, the cat popped up again.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Bruce Danton, Derek Chambers, Shaun Knock, Daud Khan, Liam De-Maine, Ajmac 200017, Deck, Evan Hart 41, Jen, Traffy, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Ted Elliott, Marnanel Thurman, John Wakefield, Kieran Bolton, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, and John McLeod, our AMTV staff members.